Hello and welcome to the Psychosocial Distancing podcast, book read, whatever you'd like to call it. This is episode 7, but we're going to be getting into part 2 of chapter 6 on conformity. And so I'm your host, Daniel Chadbourne, and with me is your other host, Thomas Brooks.
I'm back.
I always feel weird. I never know if I want to say co-host. After referring to myself as the host, I want to give equal credit.
We are egalitarian here at Psychosocial Distancing. This is a commune effort.
Everyone is welcome, and we share in the open source that is the textbook that we're using and the resources that we try to offer our students. So today we're going to be getting into kind of part 2 of conformity. We rambled, ranted, and raved about academia and the peer review system, which may or may not have an impact on our job prospects in the future. But today we're going to get into something a lot more controversial outside of academia. We're going to talk about protest and conformity and what happens when not the majority, the minority, or a subset of the population decides to speak out or to actively engage in protest and demonstration against some injustice that they perceive. And everything that works and doesn't and may or may not get in their way is a part of it, or at least as much as we can squeeze into our standard about an hour and a half. So before we get into this, I want to kind of lay down and we talked about this a little bit last week. I want to lay down some of the basic terms, and really two kind of terms in particular, two basic types of conformity we call informational and normative social influence. And so informational social influence is, and I think I mentioned this last time, it's that public compliance with private acceptance. So you comply publicly and you believe it to be true. And so this would be something like, you're told a rule as a child and years go by and you're abiding by that rule like you should. And you don't really think that it could have some level of injustice. You don't think that it could be wrong, or it could be just something completely absurd. We conform to a lot of beliefs and ideas. I can imagine how many people out there believe that as a kid that if you swallow a watermelon seed, a watermelon's going to grow in your stomach because your parents told you that. You didn't know better. There was a lot of uncertainty involved, and you believed it to be true.
Or if you swallow chewing gum, it'll take 2 weeks to die. Are you there?
Yes, I think we froze for just a second there. We're good though. So yeah, chewing gum takes 2 weeks to digest. It's been a wild internet ride these last couple of days. So that you're uncertain about it. The person that you're getting the information from seems to be an expert. It's kind of like the old adage, when in Rome, you do as the Romans do. So when we're unsure, we follow the people around us. And then the flip side of this is that public compliance without private acceptance, or without necessarily private acceptance, and that's normative social influence. And that's because we're following because those are the rules, the spoken, unspoken norms or rules of the group.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, actually following some policy, following the literal letter of the law, that would be normative influence. Or, even if we have a group of friends, and I once assigned this written paper for my social psychology class that was basically apply social psychology to a movie. And I really enjoyed it, but I've eventually stopped doing it. And I've just said, apply to real world events. Because I have never seen Mean Girls.
Daniel!
I know. But
do you even go here?
Yes. Well, I know enough about it. And I know enough about it because I've read probably 36 papers on the synopsis of Mean Girls as applied to psychology.
I can't believe it's a wonderful psychology movie. I cannot believe you haven't seen this.
I know. It's just,
have I already chastised you on this podcast for not watching Mean Girls? I feel like I've already said the whole.
No, I don't think you have. And this is coming from someone who worked at Blockbuster and probably owns more movies than any human being needed to own in their life. Um,
Oh, I know what we're watching when I come back out to New Mexico.
yes. And again, this is a normative process that I now have to watch it because I am violating a social norm.
You definitely are.
But it's a great movie when applying to social norms. And I mean, I basically know the plot and entire synopsis of the movie and almost everything that happens but I'm not really bothered by spoilers, so I'd be more than happy to sit down and watch it with you. Uh,
I think a really good example, this just came to mind while you were talking about the differences between the two, is the mask wearing procedures that are going on right now for COVID. So like you have one group of people, so both groups of people will wear masks, but one group of people is like, oh, well, I'm wearing a mask because it's the norm, but also because I believe that it's going to stop the transmission of COVID. Whereas the other group is like, I'm going to wear the mask because I have to if I want to get groceries at Walmart,
yeah.
whether or not I believe that it's going to solve anything or not.
Yeah, and so if you're wearing it because you listen to experts and have this understanding that like it's going to help spread transmission, it's going to ultimately be a helpful thing to do. It's not just because I have to, because I'll get a fine, because my governor has something in place, or because Walmart won't let me in the store without one. And I think too, it also comes down to how we follow those norms, and maybe that's a determinant between the person who's kind of wearing it around their chin versus actually wearing it on their face. How much of that information, how much you know about it, and the like. Yeah, it's a really good example of how these processes might play out with the same action. And so, but ultimately, what this gets down to is, in these cases, we are kind of following the rules. And for informational social influence, we don't see as much of a case of groups, outwardly kind of fighting against. I mean, unless we're like fighting against ignorance. So we're trying to teach new methods, offer new techniques to say, yeah, there's different ways to do things. But a lot of things like protest come out of more of these normative, that they're based on someone breaking away from the norm. I mean, even the idea of protest is violating certain aspects of social norms. You're taking over streets, you're getting in the face, disrupting traffic, getting in the face of maybe counter protesters or people who hold different views than you. You're trying to get into the face of people in charge and say, hey, we've got this problem. We want you to hear us. We don't feel that you're hearing us. And so we're going to have to go and demonstrate. And
sometimes you take over a Capitol building with your AR-15.
And that happens too. Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about, both, protest against police violence as well as armed protest against mask wearing and staying at home. That you have, individuals who feel that they're maybe not being heard or that they want to be heard. And in order to do this, that they engage in some level of protest. But ultimately, they are violating, to some extent, norms, even though we have a right in this country to protest. There are things that get in the way. You usually have to have a permit in some cases. And, someone decides that there's a curfew in place, they can come down on your group hard because you're violating the rules. And this kind of gets us to this idea of minority influence, of trying to institute change, trying to do it proper or improper. And there are people who will say that protesting should be done a certain way. Protesting should be done peacefully. Protesting should be done non-violently. But then when you have, let's say, non-violent protests, like Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, whoa, wait. It should be done differently than that. We're not, he's not protesting this other thing. He's disrespecting the flag. Because again, he's violating a norm. We are supposed to stand. We are supposed to put our hand over our heart. We are supposed to, include God in the Pledge of Allegiance.
And repeat it over and over and over again.
And these are included as norms, things that we have taken for many people, both informationally and normatively, as kind of part of our everyday lives, when they haven't always been the case. Those things have changed. We actually see things like the changing of the Pledge of Allegiance in the 50s in a response to communism, to kind of fight against the Red Scare by reinforcing ourselves as a one nation under God, which in God we trust wasn't even on our money, going back to the 40s and 50s.
Because
But
obviously you can't be a Christian and a communist at the same time. That's just preposterous.
right, and that was essentially this kind of perpetuated idea. And again, if you know nothing about communism, or you know nothing about Christianity, or you know nothing about some aspects of current events, but you're told like, hey, this is a bad thing, these people are un-American, and you're like, wait a second, I want to be a good American. So that means following the rules. It means following the norms.
Yeah, so pretty much based off of this premise, protesting is always a lose-lose situation when it comes to how people receive it, because you can't ever protest in a way that doesn't threaten people's normative values and demand you do it differently.
Yeah, you're essentially threatening the status quo. And I think we've talked about some stuff before with like automatic thinking, where for the average person, I would argue that it's not just normative, it is informational to an extent. That I'm working 40, 50, 60 hours a week. I've got kids to take care of. I got my own life to kind of try to keep in order. I don't have time to figure out all the nuances as to why someone is protesting. So I'm going to take someone that I think is an expert. I'm going to take their view. And if that expert is biased, if that expert is skewing the information, yeah, I don't like these protesters. Will be. Right. I don't like these protesters. I don't like what's going on. And so, yeah, it can become this lose-lose situation for the people protesting.
Yeah, you disrupt me in traffic while I'm trying to get to work to provide for my family. I'm going to have a negative response to that.
Right. You spend 40 years of your life, 30, 40, 50 years of your life, being instilled with this idea of like unconditional freedom, and then you got to wear a mask when you go into Walmart. There's a lot of threat, or there could be a lot of negative feelings that are associated with it. It may not warrant some of the responses that people have engaged in, but it does kind of give you an idea on sort of where I guess the pushback comes from. And the pushback is also coming from the people who don't want to change, the people who want that system to stay in place, or have a vested interest in it.
Yeah. And that's kind of one of the things that always initially puzzled me about the anti-mask wearers, is that one, it's so easy, and two, there are societies around the world that wearing a mask every day is totally normal. Like if you look at some of the Eastern Asian countries like Japan or China or South Korea, like people just wear masks even if they're feeling a little under the weather, but they can still go to work. They'll put on a mask. Or if they have compromised immune systems, they'll wear a mask while they're on the train or the subway. And so that was always my big confusion about the mask wearing, until I kind of realized that it's not necessarily about the mask. It's more of a symbol for the norms of the culture shifting. And that's what they're protesting.
Yeah, there's a one of the textbooks I had used in the past had this sort of blurb at the beginning. It's just like, we are Americans. We're a nation of rugged individualists, anti-conformists, and it kind of gave this long list of freedom first kind of ideas, and they're like, and we all conform to that idea. but when we kind of look at this idea of how we view ourselves, and that view of Americans as individual freedom is important, and again, it's the self, that individualistic kind of mentality that is kind of ingrained, and in a lot of ways that can be really positive. It allows for this idea of personal achievement, and it allows this idea of personal growth and personal excellence, that we can overcome a lot of the systems and structures that are potentially maybe holding us back. We're not bound by merely the groups that we belong to, but as social psychologists,
we definitely are quite snug with them.
That we want to also understand that, like, yeah, there are things that in our environment that do influence us. Our parents' wealth, for instance, has a huge impact on how much wealth we're going to have. when we get
The
older.
zip code you're born into has a huge influence.
And so, you know, again, we have this idea because it's a feel good idea, and really, you know, we should feel good about ourselves and the country that we're in and the groups that we belong to, but we don't like that broken. We don't like it when someone says you can't do this,
Or you have to do something else.
or when someone else comes in and says, hey, I would like to do that too. And we've internalized that, no, but I've always had this ability, or my group has always been able to do this, and your group does something different, but now you want to do the same thing as me. And they're you know, again, it's this feeling that like you're violating the rules, you're violating how things are or how things are supposed to be.
This kind of goes into the whole marriage equality protests that happened years back, where it was kind of like, well, gay people want to get married too, but the straight people were like, oh, but getting married is our thing. Like, y'all don't do that. Like, we need to like keep marriage pure and normative and keep it within this very small frame in which we operate in. And kind of what we were discussing before the podcast started was that it was more of a, you had to like skirt that normative argument at that time and go straight to the informational, which was, this isn't about religious symbology. This is about, you know, being able to leave your possessions to your loved one after you die. This is about being able to get on health insurance with your loved one. This is about visiting your loved one in the hospital. That it was more about, you know, those actual civil liberties. It wasn't about the religious connotations of what Christianity interprets as marriage.
And this is a callback to what we talked about with schema development and how we kind of construct our worlds, is that in many cases we conflate marriage and weddings and the ceremonies that are involved with it, which is, as someone who's gone through you know, the ceremony at the end when you got to sign all the legal documents, there's nothing religious about that. It's all state mandated. It's a federal issue, and that's kind of, you know, again, when the argument shifted from you know, on the one hand, you know, talking about these ceremonies to the legal federal ramifications of things, that they're started at least to shift. And, you know, eventually making it up to the Supreme Court. It's like, well, yeah, we can't really dictate one thing or another. In the same way the Supreme Court can't change the norms of a church that says, like, we're only going to wed certain people. That the rules, you know, state, well, if we're allowing some people to get married. There was just to kind of, you know, break away when we talk about normative and non-normative behaviors. A good non-normative behavior when talking about marriage would be divorce. And there was this really interesting dilemma in Mississippi. There was a couple. This was right about the same time that marriage equality was taking off in some states, but not others. It was a same-sex couple. Two women got married in another state, like in New York, and then they moved like home to Mississippi. And then like a couple years later, wanted to get a divorce. And Mississippi would not give them the divorce at the time, because if can't get married in the state, you also can't get divorced in the state.
Oh no.
Which created this really weird norm dilemma. Of like, well, we don't want this to happen in our state, but we have to follow the rules. And if you can't get married, you also can't get divorced. But there were some issues with that. But yeah, these things take time, and the minority is you know, we take a subset, because and we do know that minority influence works. We know minority influence works because things change, and if we didn't have any subsets or some people within the group changing the group in some subtle way, we wouldn't have, you know, we would still be doing the same thing we were doing 10,000 years ago.
Right. Yeah. No, you have to consistently adapt your culture and your norms to meet the moment that you're in.
There's and I'll add this as maybe the video of the podcast, but I think a really good, especially when you want to understand rules of the group, and then what happens when you break away from those rules. Because I mean, part of what we want to get into is that what happens depends a lot on who you are and what
Mm-hmm.
group you're in. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you have a group that's very egalitarian, very open, violating norms isn't going to be that big of a deal. A group that you have a lot of freedom with. But for groups that are much more, I guess, non-egalitarian, trying to think of
Mm-hmm.
a good opposite word, but groups that are more stringent in their rules, more
Authoritarian.
authoritarian, yeah, that'd be a good
Yeah.
one. That violating rules or violating the norms can mean complete excommunication.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a really good series of Joe Rogan podcasts with Megan Phelps Roper,
Oh,
former
I love
Westboro
her.
Baptist Church,
Yeah.
and also his interviews with Leah Remini,
Okay.
former Scientologist, and they talk about their experiences within their respective churches. They talk about their experiences uh, leaving. And the Megan Phelps Roper one is really interesting because, for one hand, she harbors no ill will against her family. So she's not going in
Mm-hmm.
saying like these are terrible people. She really tries to push that interview of understanding. And honestly, like my perspective of the people in the Westboro Baptist Church, I think changed because it's really easy to not like someone. But as a
Mm-hmm.
psychologist, maybe we should step back and try to understand how they got to the point that they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And she does talk about how, as part of that church, there were ways that she could help change them, and she did to some extent. She got them to stop using certain types of language on some of their signs, because it
Mm-hmm.
was this idea of like we're not really helping people, even if you view that we're helping people by chastising them. We're not helping people by using this language, and we're going to bring more people to us if we're not. Okay, we can go out and yell at them, and we can throw these really offensive slogans on there, but maybe we don't use certain words.
Right.
But also what happens when she left, that when she finally left, she was cut off.
Mm-hmm.
She doesn't get to see her siblings. She doesn't get to interact with her family. She's essentially dead to them. They have completely excommunicated her. And there are other institutions and whatnot that do this. And
Mm-hmm.
so it becomes really difficult to violate those norms. But if we're talking about like a bigger system, we're talking about, let's say, the United States as a whole. There are a lot of different people and a lot of different groups. And even though you might get some pushback, it's sometimes easier to find allies. It's easier to find other
Mm-hmm.
people. Pending the case, and again, a lot of it depends on your own family. The odds of being ostracized going to a protest isn't necessarily the case. It does happen. And again, it's very dependent on your group.
Mm-hmm. And also, if we look macroly, because the United States has so many micro groups, if you fall out of one group, it's very likely you will find another group to adopt you
Yes.
as well. So, like, worst comes to worst, the furries will accept you.
They are an exceptionally accepting group.
Mm-hmm.
But I would imagine even within that community, you would still expect to see some norms, some things
Mm-hmm.
that are accepted over others.
I mean, there's a little bit. It's a pretty permeable barrier. I think the only thing they've had a hard no to is the Nazi furs. I think
And
that's the only group that they've really like gone out and they're like, not you guys, but
for
everybody
anyone,
else is welcome.
just listening to us, um, if you are going to Google furry, do so with Safe Search.
Yes.
I had a student one semester that when I finally said do so with Safe Search, I heard a voice from the back of the class go, "Yes, do so with Safe Search." Because they apparently looked up what furries were. So these are, not just, there's only what, it's about 20% are in the sort of full anthropomorphic suits.
Yeah, or less than that. Yeah, no, the suits are like
They're
very
expensive.
expensive. They're like $15,000 expensive,
But
and
yeah,
most of them are poor and young.
and there is a subset of those individuals who have strong Nazi ideology,
Yes.
and typically not well received by the mainstream versions of their
No,
group.
they're not allowed at conferences or the conventions, at
And that
least.
says a lot.
Hmm.
So yeah, so we've talked a little bit about conforming pressures and whatnot. You've done a little research on like, minority influence,
Hmm.
of what can impact this, and I guess maybe we should like lead into examples as we're getting in to this.
Hmm.
And so I want to start with the bias of the week. We're gonna just get everything out early.
Ah.
Video of the podcast, bias of the podcast. Um, the bias of the podcast is the identifiable victim effect.
Oh no.
Because I figure if we're going to be talking about protesting, recent protests of police violence, we're going to talk about protesting specific events and specific shootings. In this case, this is a perfect one, and it was actually first identified by Schelling in 1968. It is not a new effect. It is the
Mhm.
tendency to respond more strongly to a single identified person at risk than a large group of people at risk.
Mm.
And the way I kind of take this is that, so, a lot of these protests are spurned by a single event. Now, more names get added to the list, more people get involved, but in the end, they are ultimately protests about systematic issues.
Hmm.
And again, a listener to this discussion could make comments about number of X number of group who actually is affected, but that's kind of what the underlying issue is, that there is
Right.
a propensity of violence with very few checks, and in some cases complete immunity, regardless of the necessity of that violence.
Hmm.
And it's very difficult to throw out a bunch of statistics and say, this is what we're fighting for.
Right. Which is why there's more of the say their name norm, I guess, within like the Black Lives Matter protest right now, where you do speak the name specifically of the person who was victimized at the location in which they were victimized. And so each individual protest may collectively all be protesting the system, but each one in isolation is specifically protesting a particular victim within that community.
Right. And for the community, it's a lot easier for them as well to see that singular victim as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
the larger system at play. Because again, we are limited in part to our understanding of what's going on, to kind of nowadays with the internet, it makes it a lot easier. But we go back to, let's say, the late 60s when Schelling was doing their research. You're probably not hearing much more. You're not hearing what's going on in other cities. You're not hearing what's going on in other communities. But you do know this one instance that's happening in your community.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's endemic of that issue that everyone else is protesting, you can hone in on that.
Right, because then you have that specific victim, that specific experience that then connects to the larger systematic protest.
Right. Yeah, and much in the same way, again, we can hone in on specific examples. And then also how things like specific examples and specific individuals engaging in specific behaviors can be a good way for you to remember application of how some of these processes work, more than just the kind of broader effects of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that takes us to minority influence research.
Yeah. So what's the point? What are we achieving here?
If it's a lose-lose situation, if you're going to get flack, if people are going to come out against you, if they're going to try to run your name through the mud because they either maybe don't have all of the information or want the system to stay status quo, why should you fight back?
Mm-hmm.
Or what can you do to make it better?
Mm-hmm. I guess I can go ahead and start. I have two effects that were found. So this is from a meta-analysis by Wood in 1994. So it's a collection of studies. They measured the accumulative effect of all of these studies to kind of determine if these effects were legitimate and how powerful they were. And their two main takeaways from this was that one, minority influence is mostly most effective in indirect ways. And so if you take a single protest, you're probably not going to get the majority on your side with that single protest. You actually need to have kind of a history and a trajectory in mind whenever you're doing a protest. So like the one that's going on right now in, where is it, Wisconsin? That specific protest is not going to necessarily change anyone's mind, but the next protest or the next event, you're going to win more people over because you set a precedent. And so you're influencing people's not specific, conscious, direct opinions. You're not going to change that this time, but you're going to start laying a foundation for thinking about these issues and these events for later decisions that this person in the majority group is thinking about. So this one may not affect them, but the next one has a higher likelihood of doing so. And so you're mostly working with kind of future projection when it comes to influence. And also something interesting that they found was that you want to remove the otherness as much as possible. And so if you can keep the majority members from thinking about this issue as a specific minority issue and something that is endemic of the whole, or something that they can empathize with, or something that they can identify with without violating the majority norms, then they're much more susceptible to going along with it. So like we were talking about with marriage equality, it wasn't that they were wanting the out group to join the in group and change the way that marriage was done or defined or symbolically shifted. That wasn't going to work. What you had to do is empathize with hospital visits, legal representation, institutional equality and civil equality in terms of how individuals are represented under the law. And that removed that minority identifier, so it became more influential in the long run.
And even then, to some extent, it needs institutional change at some legal level, with multiracial marriage and same-sex marriage, both as really good examples of that, where it took these big Supreme Court decisions, and looking at it 10 years later, if we're talking about the Loving case from 73, where are we at with that? Almost 50 years later, there are still people who are going to be against it, but at that point, like, if you grow up in a world where it's just legal,
that's a norm.
It's a norm.
Yeah.
It's like kind of what you said, though. It made me think that kind of Black Lives Matter is sort of a double-edged sword with this. That it's on one hand, they're following that kind of finding in the article. It says, like, if you're consistent with this, because they're protesting in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the Trayvon Martin case. I remember talking social psychology in my class in 2013, back at the very beginning of my teaching career, about how these movements, and then it kept going and it kept going, and then kind of waned a little bit, and then now that they're back, it does offer outsiders this extent of going, hey, yeah, they were protesting like 3 or 4 years ago about this, or they've been consistently protesting about this, and all this stuff keeps happening. Maybe they're onto something.
Right. And Black Lives Matter is more popular right now than it has ever been. And so that worked. But if we go back to the second part, where you need to distance the minority identity from it, it does not do a great job, because that's where you get this reactionary all lives matter situation going on.
It's this attempt for inclusiveness because the majority feels that their group is threatened, that they're taking their voice away. I'm actually seeing some hope, though, particularly with more of the poor white working class, because on one hand, there's kind of this tradition of rednecks that they don't call the cops because the cops just make everything worse.
And so that I'm finding is being brought up more and more on, say, my Facebook feeds and within libertarian circles that I follow. And so that's kind of removing the Black Lives Matter aspect of the police violence protest so that white people can also go, oh, wait, yeah, no, my parents told me never to call the cops. Like, because the cops are terrible in this town because they do X, Y, and Z.
There's a
And
long history of backwoods Louisiana, and
yeah, like nobody likes the cops. Like, so there's that aspect to it. And then there's also a break in the right wing that I've noticed that I hope I get to stay on. It just started lightning. Where they've divided into the All Lives Matter camp and like Blue Lives Matter, and the group within the right wing libertarian circles that calls that group bootlickers.
I mean, because it doesn't matter kind of what side of the spectrum that you're on. If you're anti-authority and anti-big government telling you what to do, and a bunch of military armored clad Department of Homeland Security people show up and start tear gassing people, you don't like that.
Yeah, so there's a fracture in the right wing too, where the authoritarian Republicans are like, Blue Lives Matter, but then the libertarian Republicans are like, oh no, we don't support the bootlickers and we don't call the cops. And so there's kind of, I feel like there's a little silver lining of hope, but this is the first time this has happened in like the 7 years that Black Lives Matter has been going on.
Yeah.
And so that consistency is very important.
It's kind of like the idea that you're kind of forced to think in check of what your group's kind of core norms are, and so your political organization's norms. And if you're, and in the same way that if you were, an independent and decided like no, I'm for this or I'm for that, but this goes against this core belief, this core ideal I have about something like personal freedom. Going back to that view of American personal freedom and liberty, and the kind of that true libertarian sense, that you're going to look at this and go, wait a second, I don't have to necessarily maybe agree with like the protests and the slogan, but I definitely don't agree with this.
Right, exactly. And so I think that's a bridge that the protesters would be wise to start building and exploiting. I think I know we kind of briefly brought up maybe talking about the Bernie Sanders campaign and why it was successful, and it lasted a good minute, so 5 years, and it stayed on topic with universal health care, and it was able to bridge minority-majority divides because a lot of people don't have health care. And so that was kind of a shared experience that kind of broke away from this minority-majority tension and identification section. And so that could be why it was argued that it was more successful than other socialist attempts. Not that he was an actual socialist.
Yeah, more of a have-nots kind of argument, as opposed to that's just sort of us versus them, or being told that they're actually out to get you for so long and realizing that they're fighting for the same stuff that I'm fighting for.
Right. So it's really based off this Wood article. It mostly works indirectly, so you got to give it time, and you have to minimize the differences between the groups as much as possible and get them to identify with that problem together.
The other two, and then there's another like textbook that had some additional research and information that had always stuck with me. Is they also looked at things like consistency, and so I think the Black Lives Matter movement's a great example of consistent, on point messages. So even if you're not including the majority because your group is literally Black Lives Matter, you can still be consistent. And so when someone says, hey, but what about this? You say, nope, this is what we're fighting for.
Yep.
Like, we can fight about other stuff later, but like, we need this first. This is a first step. And I think you see that a lot with, let's say, like the Bernie Sanders camp. It's like, this is what our kind of consistent message is. And I think there are the certain politicians that have kind of been welcomed with sort of open arms into that movement, who are from certain areas where that is a much easier message to sell and an easier message to promote and fight for than across the United States right now.
Right.
Or in gerrymandered districts, or in states where it might be very difficult to get a leg up because, again, everything's carved in such a way to where the only constituents I have to deal with are very opposed to me.
Right.
But that consistent message, and that was very different than when you look at other groups like the Occupy movement, and so I would imagine I'm eventually going to get to a point where I'm talking to students who have no idea about the Occupy movement. I actually had this realization that when using flashbulb memories and cognitive psychology for my my undergrads, that I'm getting near a point where I'm not going to have students, on average, like freshman level students, who are alive at all when 9/11 happened.
Right. I mean, like, to make you feel old, like, I only know about Occupy from like a post hoc research, because that was like pre-junior high for me.
So for anyone listening who has no idea what it is, the Occupy Wall Street movement was kind of a group of anti-capitalist, anti-big bank, kind of fighting against the system. And it turns out that they were kind of right, because the 2008 recession happened, when the banks were bundling all of these shady mortgages. But they went and essentially occupied Wall Street. They went and camped out. They went and protested for days, for weeks. They set up camps, and they basically went and fought the system. And they actually got a seat at the table for a very brief point in time. They finally came out and said, all right, we will listen to you. And the problem is that the Occupy Wall Street movement was about 7 different subgroups, at least.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening is that when they go, all right, well, what do you want? Well, one group says this, one group says that, one group says something else. No one's consistent. And that lack of consistency essentially destroyed their message. They did not survive that moment. And so consistency being important, but also, like, again, focusing on those informational. So we talked about trying to push indirect messages. So you might be demonstrating against these norms that are in place, but finding ways to not talk about the norms, because the norms they're there. They're going to be really hard to get rid of. They're the standard. They're the law. They're what's set in stone, at least to some extent. And using that informational social influence can also be really effective. So going in and saying, all right, we're protesting these events. Here's what we know about them. Here's what's actually happening on the streets. Here are the numbers. Here's the statistics. Because, again, the average person may not know what's going on. And you can kind of slowly move your way in by kind of presenting that information, especially when there's some uncertainty.
Right. And I would say that the Occupy movement, while not successful in its immediate goals, if not for that, we wouldn't have had Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I mean, arguably that a lot, because
that was kind of the first coalition of those groups that happened. So a lot of the foundational work was done there.
And I mean, I would argue that if you look at the history of Bernie Sanders, he's been fighting for this stuff since the 60s and 70s.
Right. No, he absolutely has, but he hasn't had that national platform. And I think a part of that was built at that time.
Yeah. And again, we could even look at the Bernie Sanders movement as an example of conformity, breaking conformity, kind of going against the sort of system, seen as an outsider. He's an independent, becomes a Democrat to run for president, and is kind of going against the DNC. He's going against the establishment. And there were a lot of people, I think, who liked that, who kind of joined his coalition and maybe left after he didn't succeed, but because they saw it as like, wait a second, he's showing it can be done. He's showing we don't have to necessarily do things the same way we've always done it.
I think he had more crossover political support in 2015 as opposed to this year, because I think he internalized some Democrat group norms when he decided to be a part of, like work within the system, because he was totally outsider beforehand. And
Yeah.
so he was, and then when, after getting some Democratic leadership positions and working and building his coalition and incorporating more Democrats in, he lost a lot of that right-wing libertarian independent support that he had in 2015. But I will say the overall success of Bernie Sanders is that, like, I've heard way fewer right-wing people talk poorly about that man than any other politician.
And I mean, you can see what actual politicians that he works with say about him. I mean, even the most hardline anti-Sanders politician is like, well, I mean, he sticks by his guns. He's always been consistent.
Always been consistent.
The nice
He's
guy to
got
work
a track
with.
record. Changing. Yep. No. So I think, I mean, he didn't succeed, but I think we're getting very close.
Yeah, and again, he's consistent in his message. He's fighting informational over the norms. He's not. He's obvious, he's challenging the norms, but he's fighting those norms with information, this kind of informational social influence. Because again, he's touching on a lot of things that people don't maybe have all of the information about, and you get that because we want to know, we want to be certain. To some extent, we're willing to maybe listen to people who don't know because they're perceived to be experts. And we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah, no, there's several categories of people that we can conform to.
But kind of as a last note, one of the other things that I kind of have on our docket that you wanted to bring up is some of the research regarding personality and conformity. And so, what might increase or decrease someone's willingness to conform or to reject the system?
So I'm a little ambivalent about this list. So this list is in the textbook. I'm going to need to do some research on it to know specifically what it's referring to. But for predictors of conformity, we have authoritarianism, which makes sense. So needing clear-cut answers, needing clear hierarchies, needing specific rules to follow, everything very black and white. But we also have the personality constructs of conscientiousness and agreeableness. And those seem very
I might be able
in
to
line.
answer that for you. If you, because that kind of looks at... Oh, yeah. You got it.
Yeah, no, I'm on board with conscientiousness and agreeableness because it's all about making sure that people like you, that you're facilitating positive interactions, that you're being responsible, that you're being orderly. Whenever there's someone who's like, hey, do the thing, and you perceive them in a position of power, or if there's a group that says you should be doing a thing and you perceive that group as being in power, you're more likely to do the thing if you're high on conscientiousness and agreeableness.
Right.
Because you just want to get along, man.
That's
be an
also
upstanding citizen.
It's also that research that says that kind of your ability to buck the system or kind of stick with it. They even look at things like liberal conservative leanings on whether or not your room is messy.
Oh.
And that,
what is the outcome of that?
Well, if it's messier, you don't care as much about like conscientiousness side of things. And maybe you're okay with a little chaos and disorder in your life. And so maybe you're less open to kind of rigid, things all need to be in place, things need to be perfect, versus if you have to have everything in order, that conscientiousness ties to, maybe a need to conform and follow the system. And so you tend to maybe be a little more conservative because in the non like U.S. political system, when we talk about philosophically liberalism and conservatism, liberalism is change. You need to change something about the system, and conservatism is I want things to stay the same, or I want things to revert back to the way they, in the good old days, what they used to be.
It's very nostalgic.
Yeah.
So two factors that predict specifically non-conforming behaviors are moral reasoning and social intelligence. And those are kind of vague for me.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, that's nice. What kind of moral reasoning? Because there's different kinds of moral reasoning. Are we talking like the specific rules don't matter, it's the spirit of the rules that matter?
I mean, it could have something to do with oh, and I'm trying to remember his name now. Kohlberg.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Refer back to podcast number 1.
yeah, to Kohlberg, and this idea of kind of black and white morality is the most basic, lowest level of development, and then we have I just
Mm,
follow the laws. But if you're at that highest level of kind of Kohlberg's moral reasoning or moral development, you kind of take each one and say, all right, is this fair? Is this just? There may be laws
mm,
in place that aren't. You know, for example, while I might scoff at the Louisiana law that says you have to keep your alligator on a leash,
mm-hmm.
I see the benefit in it. I would prefer, if you're going to own a pet alligator, you should leash it so that it
We
doesn't run after me.
we have a friend in common who's had pet alligators.
Oh,
Yeah, our Dr. Henley.
oh, I
He
didn't
and his
know that.
wife. Yeah, they've had 2 alligators, and they would walk them on leashes and harnesses.
That's that's both adorable and fitting. Uh,
Yep. Nope.
but yeah, but I might look at another law and say, wait a second, this law says that I can't whistle on Sunday.
Hmm.
What's the point? Or a law that hasn't been enforced in 100 years but is still on the book. I mean,
Right.
if I'm following that very basic view of like legal kind of moral reasoning, um, and that actually comes into. I mean, there are individuals who complain about things like moral relativism and wanting to kind
Hmm.
of look at things like the situation or um, whatnot concerning morals of different groups and morals of different situations and different laws that have been put in place that might be what they're getting into. And if you're a little more willing to
Hmm.
say, well, maybe it isn't always good or
Yeah, I
bad, good
think
or
that may be
evil.
what it refers to. But also, people who complain about moral relativism are just as guilty of moral relativism as anybody who advocates for it. You can't not be.
Right. Well,
Um, and then social intelligence. But you know what these 2 factors really make me think of is that what you said earlier about American norms and how we're all like super smart individuals who buck the system. Like
it's,
this seems a little self-aggrandizing.
yeah, we're all super smart, super intelligent. We're very moral. We're very ethical. It's our positive self-image.
So I
It's
feel like I have high moral reasoning and social intelligence, and
I,
that's why I don't follow the rules.
I did
Okay.
this. I did this research to make me feel better.
Easy there, John Wayne.
Yeah. So yeah, I know that there is some research on morality, particularly like
Hmm.
moral foundations theory that looks at how the morals that we have are heavily shaped by our environment. So
Hmm.
the pillars of the foundations of morality are things like culture, important leaders in our lives, so parents, pastors, whoever they may be, other religious leaders, as well as things like our experience and even taking into account some innate things. So there does seem to be an innateness where even children who haven't quite developed the ability to talk can still understand, when shown an event with 2 puppets where one steals from another, that one is bad and the other one is good, because like they empathize with the puppet who gets stolen, has something stolen from them. And this is at a very 2 years old. So
Hmm.
they're at this very young age and they're still able to kind of comprehend that. So that can also play a piece of the puzzle of this. And they find that with these kind of 5 moral foundations, or these 5 moral traits, there are some pretty striking differences. And when we look at things like liberalism and conservatism in terms of the 5 traits, when we look at willingness to conform and not conform, that's actually one of the traits. Authority versus subversion, where
Hmm.
you follow the authority or you subvert. You say, nope, I'm not going to follow it. And what we tend to find is, go ahead.
Oh, I was about to say there's also the other measure that's loyalty to the group as well that you can see conforming predictors in. It's not just
Right.
an individual authority as well.
Yeah, and they find these differences pretty striking. That with all 5 is what we tend to see in people who are really far on the conservative versus liberal spectrum. On the conservative side, And then for people kind of far on the liberal side, it tends to be mostly with two: careness and harm. So more care than harm, and more fairness, inequality. But you still find that care and equality are still important regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on. And that these are all a spectrum. So everyone kind of falls a little bit here and there, and most people fall, somewhere in between. We're not all kind of extremist on moral foundations, at least for the most part.
Yeah.
But yeah, that these ways in which, these little aspects, these things that we wouldn't think might influence our ability or inability to, sway us towards or have us reject conformity.
Because you can't be totally nonconformist.
No, we all conform to a lot of little things. That's my favorite definition, and I think I talked about this in the first episode, is that influence of the real or imagined presence of others. So we are still... Oh, go ahead.
This is a perfect example. We're conforming to the natural flow of dialogue, trying to be polite and letting each other speak.
Right.
So no, that's what I was going to say, is that, yeah. We can get really micro with this.
Okay, I'll go. So
that's all I was going to say. I was just going to point out the obvious, this whole structure of this conversation is conformed.
Yeah, and again, we conform to the jobs that we belong to. We'll definitely talk about this a little bit, maybe with the chapter on aggression, because we will eventually talk about Zimbardo and social roles and role conformity, that we conform to these roles that we prescribe to. For the longest time, pandemic completely destroyed it, but for the longest time, I was a very button-down shirt and slacks wearing kind of person. I'm slowly evolving into maybe a button-down shirt and jeans. Now it's t-shirt, and maybe I wear shorts during my lectures. No one will know.
You're regressing to our advisors stage.
Yeah, shorts and a t-shirt all the time.
Shorts and a t-shirt.
But a lot of that too is dependent on the people I work with. So I had a professor who wore shorts and a t-shirt because it was southern Louisiana, and summers are 100% humidity, 110 degrees outside, and so you wear shorts and a t-shirt and no one gives you too much flack for it. Or where I can feel like, as long as I look semi-respectable, should be fine. If I wear a t-shirt and jeans, or a decent shirt and jeans, I should be fine. But conforming to some degree generally means that I'm, keeping my job. There's a great assignment. I think Harvard, one of the big Ivy League institutions, it kind of popularized it, and I found it online on one of their sites. But it was the violate a social norm assignment. At least that's where I found it originally. But I would have my students do it. And I would have this big caveat of look, we can violate norms, but there are norms I don't want you to violate. If I have to explain to the dean or to campus police why you were streaking across campus for my assignment, that's not going to work. Because some level of conformity is good. It kind of keeps us bound together. It keeps us, kind of within a social contract of how we should generally act. And that might be why something like social intelligence, which could just be a fancy way of saying our ability to kind of navigate our social environment, to understand that there are some things that are okay to do, there are some things that are not okay to do, there are some things that maybe we should fight against, there are other things that we should probably keep.
Just having the perception and the judgment to evaluate what's going on and act appropriately.
Right. To know when the appropriate moment is to do something, or, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't do this. It's inappropriate. Maybe I shouldn't say this or use this example because it's inappropriate, as opposed to just doing it, letting whatever words come out of your mouth.
Let's see. What else do we have on the slot?
So we kind of have two last things to talk about. One, I think, deals more with conformity and how people conform to others, and maybe people's ability to break away from some of that conformity. And that's with power, which we did address a little bit last podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing, which I'm almost thinking maybe we should save for another topic, even though because I could talk another half an hour about it, is de-individuation, losing oneself. And so
Mm-hmm.
what happens when you're not not necessarily planning to lose oneself in conforming pressures, but you end up doing so anyway.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if we save that one, I think we have a pretty good third episode for this chapter that we could do.
Just talk about de-individuation in the internet. I think
Yeah.
that would work. So we'll end talking about power. So what can influence these conforming pressures to get people to conform, or to, if you have a certain type of power, you can also either influence people to conform, but also break away. I mean, leaders
Mm-hmm.
become what we call in social, identity processes, the kind of the exemplars. They set the standard for conformity. So if you have a leader who's engaging in bad behavior, that behavior can become acceptable. It becomes the new
Mm-hmm.
norm. Whereas leaders who set a positive standard for the people underneath them or the people in their group ultimately influence their behavior in positive ways.
Mm-hmm. So the book had the really cool breakdown of the different kinds of power that an individual or a group can have. I think we can probably extrapolate this to a group as well.
Yeah, I
But they
definitely
had,
think so.
yeah, that's kind of the thing with psychology, is if it specifically talks about individual, generally we could probably extrapolate it to a group behavior.
And if not, as group researchers, we as social psychologists, we will do it anyway.
Oh yeah. So the first one is reward power. And so reward power is someone or a group that can distribute positive or negative rewards. So this is kind of the behaviorist reward system, where positive rewards are the addition of something pleasant and a negative reward is the taking away of something unpleasant. And so this is someone who's like, probably someone with reward power would be, I don't know, like your boss who's in charge of your paycheck.
Yep. Yeah. If you do this, you're fired.
Mm-hmm.
And so as long as you conform, you get to avoid that negative reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Or you get to keep, or you get to avoid the punishment.
Right. You avoid the punishment and you get to keep you get your paycheck.
You get it through negative reinforcement.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
the second one would be, so the second one is coercive power, which is specifically deals with punishments.
Yeah, that would deal with
So I
that.
guess
So
it's kind of a dual role, maybe.
yeah, or I mean, in reward power, it could just be something like, hey, if you do this for me, I will give you this. Like, nothing bad will happen if you say no, but if you
Mm-hmm.
do it for me, you'll get this.
Right.
There's not necessarily maybe there's a coercion there if you really need the money. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's definitely, I guess, maybe a little overlap with that. But yeah, that there's some power, and this maybe isn't like directly coercive. So maybe just like getting that paycheck, it doesn't have to be directly coercive. You don't have to say explicitly, if you don't do this, you're fired.
Mm-hmm.
But just by the nature of getting that paycheck, you keep going into work, you follow the rules, you follow the handbook.
Mm-hmm. So you conform to that. The next one is legitimate power, which is more ideological. And so the person or the group receives power through a process that complies with the group norms. And so we see presidents as legitimate in terms of their power because they made it through an election with majority support. Or so any sort of electoral process, or like if you have like a monarchy and birthright is seen as a legitimate passageway, then that is seen as legitimate power. So this is going to be more tied to, this is someone in power who relies on the group norms or the cultural norms in order to sustain that power.
For something like academia, it could be going through the tenure process. You've
Mm-hmm.
gone through the system. You have gone through the legitimate system to reach this level of power, which makes your job far more stable.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to get there, you have to follow or meet these expectations that are required, and so it becomes legitimate because you meet those expectations. You have met
Right.
that level of legitimacy.
Let's see. The next one is referent power, which is where the group identifies or respects the individual who is in power or the group that's in power. And so this one is going to be more along those ideological lines, except there's not necessarily a legitimate process to achieve the power. The method doesn't necessarily matter. And so you can see situations like, I don't know, when I first read this, I kind of felt like church or clergy power.
That's what I was thinking. I mean, there is like a process that goes with it, but it depends on your denomination. So that there are some where, as long as you have, and again, there are a lot of pastors who go to seminary school or get like a master's of theology. But there are cases where you could just start a church.
Yeah, like an independent Baptist or Church of Christ or non-denominational in heavy quotes. Those sorts of situations don't necessarily prerequisite a process to achieve legitimacy from your congregants. You just have to be there and be someone that they can identify with and respect and acknowledge that you have that authority. This could also be like usurpers from like a governmental social sense. So if you're interested in overthrowing the government and your followers identify with you and your message and your persona and your character, then they will support your power grab, despite not taking the proper electoral or monarchical birthright route to the power.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was trying to think. As we were talking about it from kind of the standing, like let's say I wanted to start my own church. Not that I would do that, but I am ordained by an online church that will allow me to perform marriages or marriage ceremonies. And it was kind of on my bucket list, and I was like, I'm going to do it. And so I filled out all the paperwork. Now there is it would be a legitimate process. Like I would have to go and register with the state of New Mexico if I wanted to do that. But I could, as long as I registered in advance with the state of New Mexico, I could perform a wedding ceremony. Now, what real training do I have to do this outside of the little, the packet of information I got when I filled out all my paperwork, free of charge? None really, but hey, if you wanted to be wed and you saw me as a respectable source to do it, I would gain some referent power in that moment.
And it would be kind of a different power if like an elected official married someone, because the elected official would go through the process to perform that ceremony.
Like someone appointed as justice of the peace, or or even if we're talking about having like a priest or a pastor or a minister who has some theological training and went through the actual sacramental ceremonies to learn how to do it, which would be arguably legitimate, and even though there may be referent, I mean, there's obviously a lot of potential overlap with some of these.
And then the last one is expert power. So this is through skills and abilities that you achieve your power. So for example, we have a little bit of power on this podcast right now because we're social psychologists. And so when we talk about social psychology, we have a little bit more of an influence than, say, just a random person talking about social psychology online.
If we moved on to a cognitive psychology textbook, we would have some.
We'd have some
power. We have course background. We have some background in cognitive with the programs that we were in.
But we'd probably rely more on our legitimate power, having higher degrees in psychology.
Right.
More so than our specific cognitive psychology skills.
Yeah. And and again, that and there's a little bit of both for, getting, let's say, getting to that point of getting your PhD or your master's degree, is there's a legitimate process involved. So there's legitimate power. In doing so, you gain expert power. In some cases, maybe there could be some referent power. I do some weird research and people are like, oh, that's nice. And, I get some respect for it, doing fan research.
Well, if we take someone like Natalie Wynn from ContraPoints, she's got like all three, where she's been through a graduate degree. She is an expert on the topic she's teaching about, and people identify with her, and so she's got that referent power
He does
as
have a lot of
well.
referent power. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know if you could fit the other two in. If you can get
Yeah, I don't think she's
reward and
going to punish
coercion
us.
power. Um,
I guess if you send her money, she answers your questions on a live stream. So there's a
there's some
reward.
definite reward power involved in that, and revolving around being an internet celebrity or celebrity in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's plenty of conventions where celebrities will be like, yeah, I'll sign that for you for $20, $30. Yeah.
Demonstrate your fealty to me, human, and I will sign your cardboard.
So yeah, I think that they kind of we've kind of delved into a lot of these little topics, and I don't really have an article to share. The article that I had prepared was more for de-individuation. I will save that for next
Cool.
time because it's kind of two. It's an article, and then it's an article kind of in rebuttal.
Okay.
Which is I mean they're news articles, but yeah, it'll be interesting.
Cool. I'm excited.
Because it's a very difficult. I think it's almost a moral dilemma on who do you want to side for in this situation, because it's about an internet troll.
Ah.
Yeah. So we will continue our conversation, a very long conversation in conformity and conforming pressures, with de-individuation, conforming with the group because you're kind of lost in the crowd, following the norms because you can't easily be identified, and so you kind of go along with the flow.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and so I guess with that we can call our episode complete for now till we get to part 3. Yeah, it was really good talking.
Yes, it's been a pleasure as always.
And I guess we will bid everyone adieu.
Good night.